Have you ever wondered about what economics actually entails? Well, in Greg Ipps' The Little Book of Economics, he explains these concepts simply. For some context information, Greg Ip is the Wall Street Journal commentator that covers the economy and is known for theories such as refer pain. So in today's video, we'll be going over his book, chapters 1 to 3. The first chapter focusing on the secrets of long-term economic success and how we measure it. The second chapter involves expansion and recessions, and the third chapter is tracking things like economic data. So there's two factors for long-term success, and it's no secret, but many countries have failed to nail this down. The first is demand for goods and services, or how much each consumer wants to spend. That boosts economic activity, and that's one of the large reasons why the United States has had a soft landing so far. The second factor for long-term success is supply, or productive potential. For example, population is one of the major factors. The higher the population, the more potential workers. That's why many countries focus on their fertility rate and how it must be 2.1 babies per woman for the population not to shrink. That's why for countries like China and Japan, their countries are under stress as their fertility rates are extremely low. But there's also a concept called the one-time demographic dividend, which states that if a country has less young people or children, female workers are more likely to go out of work, and because they don't have to care for their children, creating a one-time boost to the economy. China has already tapped into this one-time boost during the one-child policy. But population isn't the only factor for productive potential. It's also output per worker, commonly referred to as productivity. Now, to understand this, we can look at Nigeria. They have 32 times the population of Ireland, but the same economic size. And that's because their workers have lower output. That's because Ireland's workers have much more productivity. Now, to understand this, it can be ultimately broken down to capital and ideas. Capital referring to investments in the worker's productivity. Things like tractors would make a worker more productive. But there's ultimately the law of diminishing returns, which states that although the first investment may bear extreme fruits, the second one and the ones after that will eventually give less benefits as time goes on. But ideas can also improve productivity. Ideas are the epitome of innovation, where there's better or different products that bring items at a lower cost. By doing so, the supply or productive potential increases. Now, what role does the government have in all of this? Well, they can invest in human capital, or better education and training. By doing so, workers are more productive and thus helps the economy. But what they also need to focus on is the rule of law, which states that economic growth requires investors' money. And in order for that to happen, those investors need to be confident that they can reap the rewards of their investments down the line. That's why things like transparent laws, impartial courts, and the right to property are so important. Failures of accomplishing this include Venezuela, which has a terrible economic state currently. So with that in mind, how do we measure long-term economic success? That's through gross domestic product. And we measure gross domestic product in two ways. The most common one is expenditure-based GDP, or the total amount of money spent on stuff. For example, what consumers, the government, and foreigners spend on exports. You can look at it at nominal expenditure-based GDP, or the actual value of activity, and it's better to measure the real size of the economy. But if it's real GDP, what that means is that it removes the effect of inflation to the GDP, and thus you can see the quote-unquote real expenditure-based GDP. There's also income-based GDP, which is the total money earned producing stuff, and includes wages, benefits, and bonuses. Considering that both measure GDP, they're most of the time really similar, but sometimes there are discrepancies. Next, let's look at Chapter 2, which covers the cycles of expansion and recession. Now, what are these problems driven by? Well, consumer and business spending, it ultimately depends on views of the future, and bullish expectations boost investment, stock prices, and lending. But when expectations get ahead of fundamentals, And when the Federal Reserve does awkward things like raise interest rates, this could cause a recession. A rule of thumb is that 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP is a recession. But what happens after a recession? Well, during a recession, less people spend money, and thus there's pent-up demand. Ultimately, the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates to boost spending. But unfortunately, when that doesn't work, a recession may unfortunately become a long-term depression. Next, let's look at Chapter 3, which focuses on the 4 engines of the economy, which boost the economy, and how they're measured. The first engine is consumer spending and household spending, which is around 68% of the United States GDP. It's driven by a variety of factors. It's the largest engine on the plane, referring to the economy, and it's driven by household income and wealth. When home prices or stocks go up, it's generally a rule of thumb that a dollar more of wealth that an individual has means that they'll be spending up to 4 cents more that year, and it easily builds up. So when stock prices and home prices go up, that simply means Americans are more confident and they spend more money. Next, let's look at housing spending, and that's largely dependent on interest rates / mortgage rates, or how much interest the individual pays on their loans when they pay for their house. Because United States mortgage rates are locked for 30 years at a time, individuals don't want to buy a house or take out a loan when the mortgage or interest rates are high. Currently, it's at 7%, and that's why many people don't want to buy houses now. Thus, it's only when interest rates are low that people will lock in those rates and buy their houses. The second engine of the economy is business investment, accounting for approximately 20% of the economy. And it's the second most important engine of the economy. Now, this can be broken down into 2 areas. The first is inventories, and it's largely reliant on demand and quarterly shifts. If there's increased demand in one quarter, that means in the next quarter, that company will probably stock up on more inventory. Now, the second has to do with building and equipment. And obviously, this has to do with a lot of factors as well. For example, stronger profits could push it to try and expand its operations. Higher stock prices could demonstrate that consumers and investors are confident in their product, and thus they would expand it as well. Lower interest rates makes it more likely that they'll be able to borrow at a cheaper price and thus expand easier. Also, if there's potential profitability of the investment, that means they would invest as well to get that extra profit. But most importantly is the sales outlook, which demonstrates that when demand is growing, businesses will expand to meet the demand. But it's also vice versa. When demand is decreasing, companies not only will pause their expansion, but lay off workers and also potentially sell land. Now, the third and fourth engines of the economy are government spending and exports. Government spending refers to things like paying for tanks, defense spending, and teachers. Exports refers to what the United States exports out. But considering that the United States is a trade deficit country, exports don't play that much of a role in the United States GDP. Now, how can we understand and see these economic engines? To understand this, we can look at manufacturing, which plays a large role in business investment. To look at this, you can look at durable goods, or goods that last 3+ years. Combine this with capital goods, such as machines, computers, and tools, and you have a good guide towards business investment. The Census Bureau releases reports on shipments, order, and inventories of durable goods, and from this you can see how businesses are feeling and what they'll do in the future. There's also real estate. Each month, there will be a report of the number of constructions of new homes. What this demonstrates is the demand in the economy, and also the sales and prices of new homes. But you can also look at the construction of hospitals and highways. That goes a large way towards showing how the economy and infrastructure is doing. In order to examine consumer spending, you can look at things like retail sales or total consumer spending. So after recapping chapters 1 to 3, if you enjoyed the video or like something, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe as a good indicator towards creating future videos about Greg Ip's book. Thank you.